right, welcome everybody. This is your episode of Freedom Hub Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We are having some sponsors around today. We've got one of our regulars, yourfreedomhub.com, and some others that you'll see here. Also, before we get into any of that, do remember these are all recorded and they will be released every weekend. So come Monday morning, you'll be able to see them on these three key channels. If you're registered to be here, great, and you'll certainly want to come and you'll get reminders for future ones. If not, register with that link at the top. And otherwise, here's the three channels that we post these videos to. They are all case sensitive since they're bit.lys, so you'll want to transcribe them accordingly. And you're going to find some great ones on there. I'll show you a little selection here in a minute. Now, we are sponsored by Heaven Sent Hemp, which is a very unique product, one of the only bioactive programs we've seen on the planet. And at the same time, they're offering a special discount of 15% off if you use the coupon code YourFreedomHub4. And you'll notice it's a bioactive program for pain, anxiety, sleep, unbelievable for energy and stuff like that. So been around for a very long time, and you'll really like that quite a bit. Now, before we get into today's guest here, just wanted to kind of show you real fast. So this is the area where the videos are posted. And you'll see they go back for actually years of these videos. There's some really fantastic ones, some really amazing topics we've covered. We haven't been banned yet here, but we did get a chance to get banned over here on our Cash channel. This is a different channel we operate, and this has videos from a long time also. But this particular one with this guy that was uncovering the COVID protocol got himself banned off of YouTube. So that was rather entertaining, and there are an awful lot over here as well. So you'll see we've got an awful lot there to select from. We're still on YouTube with this channel for the moment. And as I said, we're sponsored by Your Freedom Hub and then also the Heaven Sent Hemp. This is the site right there. Now, what I want to do, though, is now let's talk about what's going to be happening today, because this is a really important topic, and I'm really excited we've got somebody like this on here to really let us know what's happening. So, Charles, I'm going to give you the honors of doing an intro here for us today.
Sure, Jeff, and welcome, Ford. Ford is someone I met a few years ago during the presidential campaign. I was helping Governor Gary Johnson a bit with his nonprofit, more of an indirect help. And we had a lawsuit to open the debates, and Ford was a videographer we hired to cover our Fair Debates lawsuit filing at the Supreme Court. It was a beautiful day. And he is the co-founder of News2Share, and he's appeared in award-winning films. He's been a producer at the Tax Revolution Institute, which I think now is called We Do Better. And he was a senior trainer at American University's New Media Center. And we're excited to hear his take on media bias and independent journalism, because I think, folks, if you didn't see it, I posted at Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter. Apparently, the mainstream news has lost 20% of its popular support among viewers. Its biggest drop ever, which I think is great. People are starting to ask more questions, demand higher quality journalism. So I think this is such a timely topic. We need real truth in investigators. So that is what Ford will discuss today.
All right, that was great. So Ford, before we get rolling, I am showing the LinkedIn site that we do maintain if you'd like to join the group. And then we are looking to have this be interactive. So as you've got questions, I would tell you to chat. You can also use your hand raise, and I'll have a chance to kind of call on you as we get cooking there. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing, and Ford, I'm giving you control of the screen.
Okay, so as they pointed out, if anybody has questions, please feel free to add them, and I think I might not have visibility to the chat while I'm presenting like this, so Jeff or Charles, feel free to interrupt me.
We're monitoring it. Yes, we will.
Okay, so my name is Ford Fischer. As they introduced me, I am the editor-in-chief of a news company called News2Share. And so to give a little bit of background, my belief basically is that independent journalism is the antidote to a lot of the problems that I see in the mainstream media. So technology has become more widely available to allow more citizens to contribute. And social media has made it vastly more consumable, right? People are able to go directly to independent journalists rather than having to tune into the television to watch news. A problem, of course, is that, in my opinion, social media networks incentivize simplification and echo chambers of opinion. And so obviously in front of you is not an exhaustive list of the social media outlets that are out there. But when you think about kind of the progression of technology, we went from WordPress, where we have the democratization of writing, people able to write basically their own news articles and so forth in long form, to Facebook, which has increased access drastically, but also inspires brevity, right? People don't read literally long Facebook statuses, watch long videos on Facebook. Twitter, which forces a reduction in the amount that you can say, right? Vastly more quantity of people participating, but limited to 2 minutes and 20 seconds per tweet if it's video, or 4 photos if it's photos, or 280 characters if it's text. Instagram, similarly downsizing all the way to Snapchat. Again, countless other examples, but basically there is this movement toward brevity, I think, in the way that social media works. So the story of News2Share, of my company, is that my first time recording activism, which has kind of become my main activity that I cover, was at Obama's second inauguration. Myself and the person who ended up being the co-founder, Trey Yingst, we filmed the Westboro Baptist Church, an anti-gay hate group, outside of the inauguration. And at the time, we didn't really have a forum for our content. And so we actually uploaded it onto a platform that CNN had at the time called iReports. And our very first time attempting journalism, we actually made it to the homepage of CNN. We weren't paid in any way, but we felt pretty impressed at the time to be literally, given that big of a platform on the day of Obama's inauguration, being on the homepage of CNN. So obviously we wanted to branch out past that. And so we started producing content on our own network. And in the beginning, we were actually pitching to mainstream media outlets to use our stuff for free. We eventually hired a social media person. And very quickly, we realized actually that raw footage would be usable by really any kind of political wing of the mainstream media. So our content was used on Fox and MSNBC, as well as CNN, in the first months of our kind of doing this experiment. So our idea at the time was to pull people into this by allowing other users to submit. So we actually created a submission feature. And our idea was to produce content both just directly to show to audiences and for the purpose of other outlets to be able to license it. So we sort of turned this into an entrepreneurship business model. And so the ways that we would make money would be licensing. Someone wants to use coverage that they missed and we had, and they'd have to pay for the rights to do it. Advertising, such as primarily YouTube, but now Facebook is also monetized, as well as contract coverage, where someone would actually pay us to do videography. And by the way, the specific screenshot that I have here, this is a screenshot of a video that I shot in Charlottesville during the violence there, as people were kind of throwing water bottles and so forth. One person pulled a gun on the crowd, as you can see in that image that I shot. Our hope was to create kind of a new model for news. And the idea was to break the trends of the formal news cycle by going as close as possible into a news situation without changing its outcome. So the kind of problem that you see is that with mainstream media, often they can't really follow close up to situations that are evolving. So the screenshot I have here is a moment that occurred in Baltimore when I covered the riots in 2015. You can see the co-founder of my company to my right, and I'm there wearing red as they were pulling a man down by his dreadlocks. We want to be close up to the situation, but not actually change what happens, right? So certain journalists will get that kind of close access, but then they're asking confrontational questions and so forth, in order to guide it in a certain direction. Our hope is to be kind of a very close-up fly on the wall. I do still perform interviews and such, but generally speaking, I'm trying to just understand what's happening around as close up as possible. And so to me, I believe that that style creates accountability for all sides of a conflict, be it protesters on one side or another, or be it, in this case, law enforcement. And so the hope is to present a situation as objectively completely and presently as possible. By contrast, my view is that the mainstream media panders to its bases, favoring niche over objectivity. So to give just the very obvious examples, for example, Fox News may be hesitant to report on situations in a way that would offend conservatives, and likewise for MSNBC of liberals. There tends to be a trend of editorializing rather than reporting. There's drama and ratings prioritized over the presentation of facts. I think a good example of that would be, for example, CNN will have these enormous panels where they throw on, oh, this person's on the left and this person's on the right, and we'll stick Don Lemon in the middle and moderate an argument. And, the more vicious that argument gets, the better the ratings are. But does that really bring us any closer to truth? And I also point out as an example the overuse of the term breaking. So in terms of how we turned this into a medium, right, our problem was that the mainstream media had abandoned objectivity. And I actually believe that we can have an underlying assumption, and some people might disagree with this, but my view is that when you convert anything into any kind of a medium, it becomes fiction, right? If you take a picture of something, it might be a representation of what happened there, but there's discretion as to the moment you took the picture, the angle you took the picture. And so in that sense, relative to reality, a photo is still a type of fiction. And so I think if you start with that assumption that anything that you convert into medium is going to become fiction, your goal should be to create the least fictional telling of a story. And so in my opinion, a method to do that is to diversify the medium by which you present a story. So in my case, the way that I do that is live stream. And so I have, a photo there of me live streaming and then what that looked like to the audience. In my view, when you live stream beginning to end, you have a situation that it is still medium. It does still encounter the problem that I just described, that there's discretion as to where you point the camera, how long you film, and so forth. But live stream doesn't allow for the alteration of time, for one thing. It also can maximize the closeness to the subject and how immediately it's presented. You're showing something as it's happening. And so that removes the alteration of time and makes people see things as they're happening and possibly closer than other mediums could provide. It also allows for live feedback, meaning that if somebody is watching and there's information that they want, they could actually ask the presenter. And so sometimes I have my comments muted when I'm on the field, but in some cases I'll actually attempt to answer people's questions in real time. If a lot of people are asking, how many people are out there, or I see a symbol out there and I don't know what it means, what does that represent? Being able to answer those things in real time, in my belief, can actually bring us closer to truth. There's a helicopter flying over my house right now, by the way, so if anybody can't hear, let me know. I'll give it a second to go by.
We hear you fine.
So, of course, this particular presentation is part of a kind of freedom-based organization that invited me here, so I think this slide might have some important view on my philosophy and kind of how it mixes. So cameras everywhere, in my view, is generally a positive in helping us find the truth, but I think there's a distinction to be had here. In my view, the public has a right to film basically everywhere, and that creates a better world, right? So in particular, I advocate filming the police, who are ultimately the enforcers of virtually any element of the state. And so I think that when the state asserts that it should have some level of privacy, the burden of proof as to why falls on the state. And so as an example, generally speaking, we have laws requiring open meetings, right? If the IRS has a meeting that is supposed to be public, it should be available to people to film. And if they have a reason that it should be private, the burden of proof should fall on them to prove why it should be private. However, I would say that this does not work in reverse. I believe that when the state is going to violate the privacy of individuals, the burden of proof should fall onto them as to why. And this concept is very familiar to us constitutionally as due process. And so I would point out that it is my belief that the state is not media, and non-state actors may all be media. In other words, an activist, for example, who might not call themselves a journalist, is still the media insofar as they're producing video or photo that documents a situation. Whereas police, even though they may have body cameras that are creating physical medium, I would not describe them as media in the same light. And so here I see an inherent conflict between objective media and authority. So the increased availability and portability of technology means that the ability to record situations is becoming more universal. I believe that this is inherently dangerous to positions of authority, especially those that are illegitimate in some way. And that means a threat to those who do harm and a relief to victims. So the examples that I would cite on this slide, for example, are, of course, the killing of Eric Garner, which, although the officers in question were not prosecuted, we only as a society are really aware of what happened there because it had happened to be recorded. Below that is actually a picture of myself filming an arrest that happened at my university while I was a student, but I actually happened to have my congressional credential with me at the time when a person was arrested for handing out literature, actually encouraging basically kitchen workers to unionize at the school. And so in terms of the future, I think there's the availability of free media technology is overpowering the state's ability to suppress it. I think it makes it harder for police to prevent themselves from being recorded as this technology becomes more available. And I think that the line between consumers and creators of media are also blurring, and I generally think that that's a good thing. Before, of course, it wasn't easy for someone to contribute to the conversation, and now essentially someone who might traditionally just be a viewer of situations that they're interested in is able to contribute to that sort of wealth. Just as a quick kind of case study, I don't believe in it. As an explanation, just before I press play on this, so generally speaking, I live stream entire situations beginning to end. And like I said, in my view, that maintains the objectivity of the recording. I also film on an HD camera simultaneously. So I tend to mount my iPhone on top of a professional camera. And so afterwards, the way that I tend to do my business is that I put the HD footage in the form of like a summary onto YouTube. So in this particular case, in August of 2018, I filmed a situation that turned very violent at Berkeley, where there was right-wingers and left-wingers sort of fighting, and then Antifa activists breaking some windows and basically setting a fire. And, so you could watch the live stream that would give you the full context of everything you saw, but I summarized it in a 6-minute video here. So I'm going to just scroll through it just to give you a little bit of it. I don't want to waste 6 minutes of this presentation having you watch the entire thing. But you can see what some of that fighting looked like. I interviewed an organizer. Followed some of the Antifa activists, around as they set up barricades to stop the police. And then you can see them basically smashing the windows of a Marine Corps recruiting center. In my video reporting, you'll notice that as I present this raw footage, there's really no commentary from me. I don't do voiceover. I don't attempt to attach moral righteousness onto it. I don't try to say that the Antifa are good or bad, or that the right-wingers were right or not right or anything like that. It's just, here's what it is. In the particular case of this Berkeley situation, it actually caught the interest of Fox News, who invited me on a couple of nights later.
Who caught this all on camera. Ford Fischer, co-founder, editor-in-chief of News2Share. To be clear, all the video we were just showing, it was yours. You saw the little credit up in the top corner. You were standing.
So again, I don't want to spend 4 minutes showing this interview since you guys can look it up anyway. But the basic point that I was going to make about sort of news entrepreneurship, as you can see there, is I was able to basically license this footage to Fox News, as well as speak. In general, I don't make a ton of media appearances. Usually my footage is just shown, and they usually have their own thing to say about it. In my case, what I tried to offer as commentary was an objective explanation of what had happened and why I believe it's important to film these things, without trying to contend to Fox News that, one side was right or wrong. I also want to add that social media censorship has become a hindrance of this kind of video entrepreneurship. So social media platforms often use soft censorship, such as demonetization, making videos 18 or plus, or outright deleting entire pages to hurt indie media. So in my case, I was one of about 1,000 pages that was demonetized on YouTube in June of 2019, after there was some ruckus over one particular YouTuber who had been viewed as bullying another YouTuber. And so YouTube decided to strengthen its rules. And in order to make an example to show that they were doing something, they demonetized 1,000 channels. It took me 7 months to convince YouTube to change it back, mostly by pushing public outcry on them, tweeting at them frequently, getting people to retweet criticisms of their decision. I think that, and I believe Charles and Jeff actually alluded to this earlier, but I think that diversification of platforms is a possible solution. So that means signing up to different outlets. I use one called Minds. There have been other attempts such as Steemit. I don't personally have an account on BitChute, but I'm aware that that's another growing alternative. And so I think that the problem, though, at the same time, is that most mainstream audiences, the wealth of people, spend their time browsing Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. They don't actually go to those alternative media sites as much unless they're referred to it. So in my view, diversification rather than migration is better. I'm probably not going to stop posting to YouTube unless I'm forced to, unless my page was ever outright deleted. But I'd like to diversify by having it in more places. If I lose one, it wouldn't be quite as damaging. And so I want to give a just brief kind of overview of kind of how the News2Share experiment has gone. I presented at the beginning sort of like what our thought process was in making it and, what worked and didn't work. So it's now been 7 years. This is an outdated version of this presentation, or, I didn't update every single slide here. We've had enormous attention, viewership, and positive feedback. As Charles, I think, mentioned earlier, my footage has been licensed both to one Academy Award-winning film. If you've seen the movie Black Klansman, then you actually have watched my footage, as well as 4 Emmy-winning films. That submissions feature that I talked about earlier, where we had the ability to actually just submit straight onto my website, while it still exists, it's not used very much. We had at one point a group called Anonymous, a hacker collective that submitted some videos on it because they wanted to release videos to the press without having kind of a name attached to it. And so that sort of made sense to them. But generally speaking, most journalists are not in the public, and people in the public are not really submitting to websites like this. And I believe that's because social media has dominated the market for user-generated content. If people film important things and they're part of, just the public, they're really more likely to want to post that content onto their own Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. And so the use of a submissions feature is a little bit less important. With that being said, to the extent that there are things that I can't cover that have to do with activism, either because of the direction, how far away it is, whether I have more than one thing that I'm covering at once, I have been hiring a greater number of freelancers to work for me with pay. And my footage has been used in multiple criminal and civil trials. And so I think that that's important, not because I necessarily favor the prosecution of individuals, but because I do think that objective accounts of what happens means that you're going to have a more just legal system. If I was on either end of a trial, civil or criminal, plaintiff or defendant, I believe that the best and most equitable or fair outcome would come from knowing there's objective video of the situation in question. So as I mentioned, footage in tons of documentaries, 4 Emmy winners, 1 Oscar. A lot of blogs and niche news sites have been able to embed my video, which is free for them. It adds views for me and allows them to write about a situation that they weren't at, as well as basically every American news network that you can think of and many international networks. In terms of the founders, my co-founder, Trey Yingst, when we graduated from college, she actually signed on to report and anchor at an outlet called One American News. but pretty soon after he switched away from there, and he is now actually the Israel correspondent at Fox News. And then as far as my future, I hope to continue developing News2Share. I'm also working on a documentary about transhumanism, which is a movement of people who basically are cyborgizing themselves, attaching technology to their body, which I think is a very interesting movement. And I am also a producer and editor on several other documentary films. That's the three, people who started News2Share, myself, Trey, and Alejandro. But we plan to continue producing content, expanding reach and scope, and I'd also add hiring more people, increasing the base of freelancers who contribute. And so with that, I would ask if anybody has any questions, and I think we came in at just about the half-hour mark. So I think this would be a good time to make it a little bit more conversational.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That was quite good. It's good to see how much you've been growing and then the acceptance, like you said, even getting to be used in a court trial. I mean, that just proves that what you're doing is valuable. So that's good. And a couple quickie questions, because there are some hands up, and anybody else that has a question, please, use the raise hand icon around the perimeter there. Meanwhile, here's my couple key questions. First off, with your using, and I saw you were on Fox and some stuff like that, do you find because your stuff is so neutral, so to speak, that MSNBC or CNN or Fox or any of all of them would look at it similarly, or is there any kind of bias even when you're trying to just show straight footage?
I appreciate the question. So first of all, I think a distinction that actually might be really important to somebody hoping to enter this work is that I actually try not to use the term neutral when referring to my work. Neutrality implies the equivalence of two positions, right? So if you have somebody who is a conservative and someone who is a liberal, right? CNN puts them both on at the same time and then has someone as a moderator. And I think that that could be fairly described as neutral, perhaps, because they're attempting to describe these two points of view essentially as equivalent or treating them as equivalent. I try to view myself as objective, which is to say that I'm not necessarily obsessed with the idea that I'm going to present counter narrative to everything that I cover. It's just that I'm going to cover the thing exactly as it happens. So if I go to a Black Lives Matter protest and film its entirety, and there's no counter protesters and maybe police stay out of it, it is one-sided. It's one point of view being represented. To me, objectivity is just showing exactly what happens as opposed to distorting it in some way. Neutrality would be filming that thing and then trying to reach out to someone who dislikes Black Lives Matter to point out their point of view as well. And that is not something that I engage in. And to be clear, I do film every different side. I have filmed neo-Nazi rallies. I have filmed Black Lives Matter rallies, conservatives, liberals, anarchists. I've filmed every manner of political orientation that you can possibly find, but I don't attempt to create that sort of contrived sense of neutrality. To answer the question about applicability, the thing that I've found is that many of the mainstream news networks are actually somewhat hesitant to grant legitimacy via platforming to independent citizen media, which directly competes with them. So I was very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to speak on Fox News, both about the situation that they had me on to talk about, as well as why I cover things in general. But out of the big, Fox, MSNBC, et cetera, all of them have used my footage on several occasions, but Fox is the only one that's actually had me on air on one occasion. And I found that it's been more like, online outlets that are much more willing to see comment and commentary and have online, to actually discuss people like myself who are involved in independent journalism. I think that more comes from a sense of competition than a sense of them having any real reason to find a distaste for my style of work.
Interesting response. And I'm just my takeaway would be it's a little bit of a kudo to Fox in that instance, because at least they probably feel like, look, our product's quality enough. We can have this competitor be on our air and it's not a threat to us. And it is newsworthy what you're doing. So by rights, it should be talked about. So that was pretty good that they actually took that initiative.
Right. And in my opinion, I'd also add that my view is that having independent and complete recordings of situations actually can force the mainstream media to do better. Before, if a outlet went to a situation and they cut it down to, say, 90 seconds for a news package, they could kind of contort it into whatever they want. But knowing that people can look at the live stream and see that it's something else, I think that that's dangerous to them if they plan to lie about it. So, I see some people in the independent media like to talk about, oh, we're going to destroy the mainstream media. I actually don't see it that way. In my opinion, independent media actually forces mainstream media to do better.
Yeah, that's usually the way it does, in fact, work, that tireless small percentage that just won't go away and shut up. But
Right.
The other thing, too, is in this little phenomenon, and so this is where just to take a personal takeaway. I know you tend to try to be kind of out of that side of it, but this rise of the Antifa that you were mentioning, this sort of came out of nowhere after a bit, and it seems so contrived in its own little way, because they seem to have a bit of a uniform, and then they always seem to, like, once they sort of get everybody up to a certain point, then like they immediately goes, okay, now it's the time is okay. Phase 2, we start busting windows now, and then then we come back and then we set fires. It's like, what are you perceiving as a rationale? What's that doing in terms of all these other? Because like you said, there's legitimate stuff that's happening, like the cop stuff or whatever. There's definitely things to address, but yet that comes in and totally. I can't figure out which side or whatever that's supposed to be helping, or what is that accomplishing for all of us?
So I think that as it relates to the Antifa movement, I think what's really, really important to understand about them is that it is extremely decentralized. When you actually interview them or talk to them, although I think naturally leaders start to form, they will actually claim that they are generally leaderless. I think that on a national level or an international level, that's basically true. It tends to be very, very chapter based, right? So the Antifa of DC, I know them very well and they know who I am. And I have basically no concern that I'd ever be, for example, assaulted by them. However, if I go to a different city, and cover Antifa there, they might have a completely different political style, right? They might engage in different tactics, and they certainly wouldn't know who I am necessarily. So it is worth noting that they do engage in different types of activism. And I think that there is a mainstream media bias towards showing specifically the things that essentially are violent, right? And it doesn't, that's not necessarily a bad thing that the mainstream media wants to spend more time covering situations of violence. Those can be more important to cover. But I think that it also creates a odd set of incentives. If you were told that your movement is only going to get airtime to what they believe when you break windows, what would you do? So I'm not making any kind of excuses for them. Again, I'm not endorsing nor condemning them. But I think that in general, some of that stuff that they do that is peaceful is not shown, and some of the more violent stuff is what there tends to be a greater emphasis on. They tend to have a belief in general that when they do engage in violence, that it's somehow defensive violence. So, I didn't get to interview the people, for example, who I filmed breaking that Marine Corps recruiting center, but I'm sure that if I was able to have an honest conversation with them, they would probably contend that, that the military in general is the aggressor on the world stage, and that therefore they are acting in a sort of existential form of self-defense or in the defense of other people by engaging in violence with them. I think that the more quintessential activity of Antifa that people are aware of them for is sort of doing street battles with the right wing. Similarly, an anti-fascist who's willing to start a fight with a right-winger at an event, they would contend that, that fascist organizing could ultimately lead to people's loss of rights or life, and that therefore hindering that organizing or striking fear into organizers could cut it off early. And so again, they would likely contend that it's a form of basically existential self-defense. Again, I'm not taking or endorsing that point of view, but I hope that answered your question.
It does, and that part does make a lot of sense. Where it does seem to come off the rails is when they suddenly do it to the local bodega of the person who they're sort of helping out here, and it's like, why? I could see a trash and Apple, okay, the man, whatever, but why you trash that little local merchant there? That like makes no sense. So sometimes it's mixed messages they themselves are creating by either allowing that or they've agitated locals to do it, and they should almost like thwart that part. But
yeah, so I would add
tactic discussion for another day. Yeah, but go ahead.
This is a very quick comment on that.
Sure.
2 weeks ago, I was covering here in DC as the George Floyd protests turned into rioting. And so although there was an element of that I would generally consider to be affiliated with the Antifa movement, there were also just a lot of really angry people who weren't really affiliated with any particular group. On one night, they actually did loot an Apple store, but they also were breaking into coffee shops, like and a place called it was, now I forgot the name of it, but it was a Indian chicken place, right? So some places that just are clearly like local businesses with almost nothing of value to take. And in some cases, it was actually some of the people who were more affiliated with the Antifa groups who were trying to stop them from targeting like small businesses, which they didn't view as legitimate targets. So I do think it's important to realize that in riot situations, a lot of individuals will act in certain ways that aren't necessarily kind of coordinated en masse.
Sure.
And often individuals will attempt to prevent it or personally disagree with their tactics. So in that case, like the Antifa people saw, police as a very legitimate target, government infrastructure, big companies. But like at one point I saw them setting fire to a car and a dude was like, you don't know whose car that is. Why are you burning that car? So it can be really mixed. And I think that the mainstream media tends to lose sight of that when they just use videos of these things as B-roll and you're not hearing the audio or kind of a complete recording of what was happening.
But of course, that's what gets eyeballs. So that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, sadly, on that, which is where like you bring some balance, because at least you can force them to not edit in a stilted way, hopefully at least, and gradually
right
move that needle. Let's get to some people with some hands up. So first off, I see Kathy's been patiently waiting. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go for it.
Hi, Ford. I used to be a journalist myself in a small city. But one of the things I've heard so much is that a lot of people are saying real journalism is dead, and it doesn't look like from you, but it is really. That it's still going and that you can, like you say, objectively cover something. And you mentioned that you sometimes face the possibility of being deleted from a platform. So are you concerned if you do get deleted, or are you really happy just to go with the other platforms? And have you considered Parler?
So, very good questions. I appreciate that. I think that part of the issue actually is that the mainstream media has kind of been infiltrating those platforms, right? So as people have been migrating away from their television sets, on YouTube, independent content creators have seen their viewership fall by roughly 70%. Over the 6 months since it was 6 months that I was demonetized, but now it's been basically a year since that happened. My viewership on YouTube fell by almost exactly the same as everybody else's, about 70%. But it's not like fewer people are actually using YouTube. So I've seen there are better people who have done more research on this, but I basically have seen graphs that show that what's happening is that YouTube is giving greater incentive to algorithmic preference to basically Fox News, CNN, MSNBC on YouTube. So there is algorithmic discrimination, and that's sort of part of what's happening. I think in my case, if I had to, I suppose I could migrate over to those other social media if I had no other choice. But I still see YouTube and the other mainstream things, Twitter, Facebook, as the outlets that the most people are on. I don't only want to reach, I guess we'll say the woke, right? So people who are going onto Parler, as you pointed out, or Minds, or whatever it is, they tend to be people who already know that there's something really wrong with the mainstream media, with the social media, and that's why they've migrated away from it. But in a way, only posting to those places would be like preaching to the choir. I want my content to be viewed by people who might have just watched something on CNN and then they look at the raw footage and go, oh, I saw that mentioned on CNN, but this looks really different than what I thought it was about. And so I think that we still need those mainstream social media platforms in order to reach that, I guess I'll say, mainstream person. So I really have no objection to most of those sites. I haven't personally played around with Parler a lot because I haven't really heard of many people who have actually migrated over to it. And so I mostly make these decisions based on reach. But I think that the basic problem would be if I went to Parler and left Facebook, I'd probably be seeing a lot of people who already know that mainstream media and mainstream social media are wrong. And I'd be losing the audience on Facebook who, really might benefit from getting that other perspective.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
It was quite good. I see we have a question in here from Kishore. Are you there? You might have to unmute yourself. I unmuted you. I'll do it again. Kishore?
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Good.
So my question is about conversations. I mean, you mentioned that much of the attention goes to YouTube, but you do have Vimeo as an alternative. So as a producer, if you want to shift the attention of the audience in some way, is there a way by which you can stimulate conversations so they are able, or they're aware of the alternatives and engage with it?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, I hear you. So I think that Vimeo is a fine platform. I don't have any particular issue with Vimeo. However, my understanding is that it tends to be best for more large, sort of completed individual projects. So it's a good place if you're going to make a documentary, for example, and you want people to, pay to watch it. Vimeo might be the way to do that. However, it doesn't seem to be where algorithm is really going to push people, right? So I have at this point about 34,000 subscribers on YouTube, and about 90,000 subscribers on Facebook, and then about 30,000 Twitter followers. It would be very hard to replicate that level of following on an outlet like Vimeo, whose reach is a little bit more limited if you're not already pushing people to it via social media. Additionally, my understanding of Vimeo is that above a certain size or quality, you start having to actually pay. And so in my case, where I might be uploading one large piece of HD video to YouTube like per day, in my case, Vimeo probably wouldn't even be practical to do that sort of continuous coverage. But I think it does still point to the same basic point, which is that diversification is always good. If someone is going to make a documentary, I would say, that they think might be controversial, I would recommend posting it on Facebook, YouTube, Vimeo, Minds, BitChute. I mean, put it everywhere. And then if a couple of places pick it off, then, it's still everywhere else.
Yeah, okay, just one more question, please.
Sure.
You mentioned Minds along the way. Is it growing? Is it competitive with Facebook?
Yeah, so I really like Minds in principle. I am friendly with the person who founded it, and I think that it has a good basic way that it works, right? It's kind of comparable to the setup of Facebook. But again, I would say that, it also has a very accessible, staff, right? If you have an actual issue or suggestion or something, you can get to them. It was very easy for me to set up an account on Minds. I was verified quickly, which is valuable to journalists. For example, I'm verified on Facebook, both as my company and my personal account. And I'm verified on Minds, but in 7 years of being on Twitter, Twitter actually still has not verified me. Minds, though, again, even if it all works on a technical level, it still has fewer people on it. By contrast, from the numbers I just said, 90,000, 34,000, and 30,000 of subscribers on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, I think I currently have like 1,300 subscribers on Minds or so. So just in terms of the raw numbers of viewers who you'll find on that platform, it's still just a lower amount of general reach. And I think that that's kind of the concern I would issue about kind of putting all your eggs in one basket as it relates to alternative sites like that.
Yeah, sadly, and that is kind of a reality of it, is that, these organizations like YouTube that push you off their platform, they don't care that you go to those other ones. You're just preaching the choir. So you're not influencing anybody that matters in their minds in certain ways. So I hear you loud on that one. Charles,
Right.
I know you got your hand up.
Yes, and Ford, great presentation. Before I ask my question, I would like to invite John DiLiberto, participating in this webinar, to raise his hand icon and talk briefly about his experience with a local newspaper startup whose aim was to expose cronyism, regulatory capture. And on that last topic, Ford, so many of us want better news to find that talks about regulatory capture, cronyism, corruption, that kind of thing, that you don't get really too much in the mainstream news. Do you have some favorite outlets of reporters and investigative journalists who do take a bit of a braver approach to get at the truth, ask tough questions, and not worry so much about losing sponsors or advertising buyers?
Is that question to John or to me?
To you. Well, John decides whether he wants to comment on his experience.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I tend to, when I'm personally consuming news, I do tend to look for more independent and more online outlets. I mean, I think that the only mainstream media source that I actually really trust and like is Brett Baer on Fox. I did intern for him in college for one semester. I guess technically I was a college associate, which is a special intern, right? But so I think that his show tends to be probably the hardest news, most objective, thing that you can kind of find on TV. But other than that, I tend honestly to just look at the individual quality. Can it be authenticated with video of individual reporting online? So there are some people who do good individual live streams, usually of kind of micro niche subjects. So in my case, it's activism, but you could find individual people who go out to do more international types of stuff. I would say Luke Rudowski might be a good example of that as it relates to live streaming, but not necessarily as it relates to commentary. There are lots of little outlets kind of budding up in that fashion. But again, I hesitate to endorse any specific journalist because I tend to find that, people could criticize me and say, oh, well, that person has this issue, this person has that issue. And so I tend to find myself trying to be objective to a fault. And that usually means not having a ton of endorsement of other folks. I do tend to share individual stories and reporting that I feel like has been well backed up by its own reporting. Has it been accompanied by video that proves the points that it's trying to make?
Very good. John, did you want to make a little comment on your situation there? I have you unmuted if you're inclined. Well, I don't see a response right away. Well, I've got you muted as you wish. David, I see you have your hand up.
Ford, you have covered domestic bias on social media. Do you see much foreign influence or bias on social media, specifically on YouTube and Facebook?
Was the question foreign interference or bias?
Correct.
Yeah, so the thing that I have actually seen a little bit of commentary about, and I personally have not, I think, encountered this a ton, but I've learned about it as a subject matter, is that it seems like there's a lot of companies kind of bending over backwards for China, specifically the Chinese, Communist Party. And so specifically, one thing that I read is that YouTube, they have certain basically keywords that they will demonetize or remove, right, or penalize. And so there were actually two phrases that are used pretty much entirely to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. One of them, for example, I have no idea how to translate this, but there was a criticism that people had, which is that the Chinese Communist Party would put people who support it, who probably are fake or bots, online to defend China in the comment section of things. And so people who were critical of China, they had a Chinese phrase that meant like 50-cent opinion or something, like the implication being that the CCP was paying people like 50 cents a comment to write, or in other words, claiming that people were selling out to the communists. And people who used that precise phrase in the comment section on YouTube were apparently censored immediately. And so YouTube claimed that this was accidental, and we'll never find out whether it was just robots that, were kind of inadvertently feeding the objectives of the Communist Party, or whether it in fact was intentional. But another example even that comes to mind is, I have covered all kinds of activism, but out of my approximately 1,500 YouTube videos so far, I was, at the time that I was demonetized, I searched a few of the words that there was a lot of research about what words trigger automatic demonetization. And one of them was Palestine. And at the time when I was demonetized, I had about 1,000 videos on YouTube. And when I searched my channel, 70 of them pertain to the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's just been a lot of activism pertaining to that subject. And so, you know, the fact that Palestine is a disallowed word doesn't necessarily mean that Google has a specific opinion on the subject, but I would tend to think that it would probably benefit Israel to have Palestine be a disallowed term or a disincentivized term, or that the people who use the term Palestine are less visible or less funded by YouTube. So that's just two examples. Again, I'm sure that there's a lot more, but those are the ones that I've kind of read about or interfaced with myself.
Interesting for sure. And there is some of that type of activity occurring. You can see from the way movies and things suddenly get altered or topics avoided and so on. Not a healthy situation for sure in that regard. They were talking about even like with comedians, there's most will never go to a college campus. It's not worth it, which is a sad state of affairs for sure. Where do you think things are kind of going? I mean, you've been seeing like, are you seeing any trends, trajectories? What are you uncovering as you're monitoring all these things? And then the other one, how do you know where to go? I mean, how do you get the insight to, oh, I better be in this town on this day because this is going to go down?
Yeah, so I guess I'll take the second part first. Because I've covered activism so much, and to some extent, I actually get people contacting me, telling me this thing is going to happen here. Can you send somebody? Right? People who do activism tend to actually want their activism to be filmed, which perfectly makes sense. That people want a record of what they're doing. In my opinion, if people think that they're right about something, then they're going to want people to see that they're right about that thing, and therefore they're going to want it recorded. So a lot of it is sort of on invitation, but otherwise I've just been I've been following a lot of Facebook pages that I know will promote rallies, following the news closely. In the case of tomorrow, I'm actually flying to Tulsa, Oklahoma, because the following day will be Juneteenth, and the day after that will be Trump's rally. And so I anticipate, based on my sort of knowledge and experience, I think that that's going to be sort of a crazy day. I don't even have specific Facebook events that would tell me that those 2 days are going to be crazy, but I just plan to be there because it just seems to be sort of a perfect storm of brewing, one might say. But I would say that Facebook events are kind of the place to look, right? If you go under really any city and you choose a specific period of time and you filter it to causes, which is usually what people set up Facebook events for protests as, you'll find a lot of basically stuff to go to and film by just that way. And I should note, most of this kind of thing that I cover really happens publicly. In effect, anybody could really do it.
Very, very good. Charles, I see you've got a hand up again.
Yes, when you mentioned how the word Palestine triggered suppression of some of your videos on that hot topic of Israel-Palestine protesting on either side, it reminded me of some of my health freedom friends with this COVID hysteria and vaccines, for example, which I imagine will trigger even larger protests as this rushed COVID vaccine makes it into the child schedule for kids going to school, and then adults to fly or get a job or travel. Last month, Colorado had huge protests against a bill being snuck through on a Sunday to restrict vaccine exemptions. And there were a bunch of protests on the issue over the past year that don't really get coverage in the mainstream media, which of course relies so much on pharma funding for advertising. Have you been invited, like you said, by protesters in the health freedom movement at all? Or would you, go ahead.
I actually have not interacted much with with that kind of subject. It hasn't happened a ton in DC, and I haven't seen a ton of turnout for it, or at least that it's in a way that's been connected to me. I think that in general, though, it probably points to an issue that I'll more broadly say about the way that YouTube deals with that kind of content. So YouTube considers medical disinformation to be a, censorable or bannable kind of offense. But there's a question about what would happen to me as media if I cover people engaging in what they consider to be medical disinformation. And so I don't want to attempt to comment on here about whether or not those people are right. But if I was to film them, and if YouTube were to declaratively make the point of view that they are wrong, should I be censored for filming them? The way that this has come up for me, really in practice, is that a lot of my coverage has been of basically racism. Right, I've filmed neo-Nazi rallies. I've filmed really all kinds of racism that you could imagine. I have filmed Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam. On sort of the other side of the racist spectrum, I guess you could say. And, YouTube has marked some of my content as potentially hateful. And that's why they pushed the demonetization last June. And so I have been pushing this question with YouTube, and I have a clear answer for me. But the question is filming and documenting something happening the same as basically like engaging in it, right? So when I film someone engaging in hateful speech and I'm there as a journalist to document that happening, is my video hate speech? I would contend that it certainly is not. YouTube has backed down on that question as it relates to me by admitting that they made a mistake. But generally speaking, YouTube has, I think, had the flawed logic that those two things are the same.
That's a very good response for sure. And that is a very green line to kind of skate between, which is important to kind of finally get defined and to qualify, which is great. Boy, I appreciate, I wish we could talk all day. We've been really cranking along here. So I wanted to thank you so much for today here.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Before we dart out of here, where you're saying, let's kind of close out and give you a little update on what's going to be happening into the future. But we have yet another new sponsor with us here today, which is great. And actually, it turns out we've got somebody that's come on here that's actually had some experience there. And what they've worked out for us, in fact, which is pretty neat, is that they're going to give a special personalized consultation with the doctor who's behind us. And you can see he has a lot of degrees there. And so they've got a special thing where they're going to give it for free. So all you have to do is just go to their site and you'll be able to take advantage of that. But I was going to say, I think that Sonia is here real quick. Are you there? I'm going to unmute you for a quick minute. Why don't you give me a little rundown on your situation? There you are.
Yes, hi.
Hi there. Thanks for coming in here today. I appreciate that. This is a nice coincidence. You had some time to share with us.
Yeah, I've been using the products for a couple of years now, and I have really seen a difference. So much so that I've got my mother and my two daughters using them, and I'll recommend them with my eyes closed, hands down, to anybody.
Oh, that's great. And just to be aware why we like it as well, it's not like it's kind of a multi-level marketing, or it's not like it's a company thing. This is just a company that's really making some unbelievable stuff, and some of it quite controversial, because this is the fellows had solutions for SARS and some other very controversial topics. So that's really fantastic. Now, also, we do, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this coming up too, but we've got a special program that's launching in a couple of weeks with our health savings account oriented cash patient program. So I'm going to tell you to tease you a little bit to stand by for that purpose. And on that note, we're going to definitely conclude for today, and we'll see you in a week.